Good morning. So welcome to Legal Lens, a chance to discuss everything distribution and legal combined. So over the last couple of days, we've had lots of discussions around distribution, the complexities, and all the challenges that come with it. So what are the legal implications of all that? How do we deal with that type of regulatory issues that come with it? To discuss that, we have with us a leading legal expert on travel, hotels, and technology, Caroline Hobson. So Caroline, if you'd like to just introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm Caroline. I'm a partner at law firm Cooley. My core area of focus is antitrust, but I do quite a broad area of other kind of regulatory areas and have worked for various clients in the travel sector.
Thanks, Caroline. Great to have you here. I'm Vineet. I head up distribution and commercial planning for Wyndham Hotels and Resorts in EMEA, about 550 hotels, but Wyndham globally, about 9,100 hotels that we have. So why are we talking about what we have here at the moment? It's got to do with the complexity driven by different countries doing different levels of regulation, legislation around different things, different levels of adherence, short-term rentals, challenging accommodation sectors in certain regions, tech companies growing fast. Really, regulation hasn't kept up as fast as we'd like to have seen. So where are we now? Essentially, we've had a spate of regulations at one time that includes the familiar GDPR and so on. But equally importantly, there are a whole range of new legislations and regulations, some driven by the EU, some driven by the Competition and Marketing Authority in the UK, and so on. And lots more coming, I'm guessing, right? So to kick this off, Caroline, if we could start with asking you, what are some of the current regulatory issues that you're seeing and what's driving some of that?
Yeah, well, I think there is a huge amount of regulation coming. Even us as lawyers are really struggling to keep up, actually. And it's a focus for us to go, are we on top of all of this for our clients? So I have great sympathy for business, actually, in trying to keep track of regulation at the moment. I actually think it's almost a bit of a legacy of regulators being just not keeping up with what's happening, actually, in various sectors. And so we've ended up now, and we're going to cover this in some further questions, but there's a huge amount of regulation, really, coming online to regulate the digital environment. And arguably, that could have come in a long time ago, but it's taken a long time. So I think there's a bit of a lag, and we've ended up now with a significant body of regulation coming in all at one time, more or less. But look, I think there's some other factors here at play. Certainly sitting here in Europe, policy agenda being led largely by the European Commission and member states through the European Union. There's some big sort of, standing back, there's some sort of high-level factors here. Firstly, we had COVID that devastated the travel sector. Mm-hmm. And that is, two issues have sort of come out of that. One is it's absolutely imperative to kind of get the travel sector back up and running, partly because there was a lot of handouts. And because there was a lot of handouts from member states to various players across the travel sector and leisure sector, it also means they come under greater focus. As a sort of quid pro quo. I think, so that's one sort of factor that sits in the background here. The other one is, obviously, as I mentioned, huge digitalization. It's always a struggle to say that word. But, we all transact now online. Your customers and consumers are all transacting online. Huge changes in how things have been done. And therefore, they're very keen and concerned to make sure that those run fairly and transparently for users, and are not, they are nervous about big gatekeepers, for example. thirdly, the other big sort of policy agenda is environmental. And perhaps less so in hotel distribution, but more broadly across the travel sector, what they are keen to do is promote sustainable travel. And that means looking at more interconnected travel and better facilitating that. So we're going to see more emphasis on some of those issues. But standing back, what that all means is really that travel is a key focus, because you've got elements of consumers and data and digital and environment, and all those policy factors mean that there's a lot of focus, I think, on the sector.
Okay, no, thank you. And you mentioned the environment side of it as well, because initially just around COVID and post-COVID, there was a big emphasis on sustainability and sustainability initiatives, but the European Commission is looking at legislating on that too, right, in terms of sustainability as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of the labels that are put on by different operators and so on.
Exactly. So it goes right across the board. I mean, you could say there's some form of regulatory overreach, actually, in many of these areas. I perhaps would say that being a Brit and following Brexit, but I don't think that's necessarily what's motivating the comments there. I think we're seeing a lot of regulation being pushed through pretty quickly, certainly at European level, and even, European Commission actually struggling to keep up, to be able to kind of push all this legislation through and implement it effectively. But yeah, I mean, that's a good example of it going right across the board.
Yeah, but the primary concern is really protect the consumers. Is that would you say that is the primary sort of?
Yes, I mean, look, that's always what they are seeking to do. They're seeking to ensure that consumers are well protected. Okay. So as a consumer, I am transacting online and with travel providers. I'm being treated fairly. I'm getting value for money. And the other big policy factor here is cost of living crisis. And that's shaping a lot of policy. That's shaping, our travel providers, for instance, in COVID, there was a lot of focus on all the refund policies and how consumers were being treated. Huge amounts of work, all member states, a lot of work in the UK. Various companies being taken to task by the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK for not providing fair terms and fair policies to their consumers. So much, much bigger focus now on that consumer element in terms of some of the regulation coming through.
Okay. And in terms of the major sort of regulations that have come into our world, let's say in the last year or 2 years, is that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act? Are you able to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the kind of areas of regulation and areas of focus, so one area is around consumer interest, and that's picking up some of what I was just discussing, but making sure that consumers know who they're dealing with online and actually what they're seeing is reflective of what the true offer is, and not being misled, and having some transparency, and also ensuring that their data is being protected. So you've got this whole consumer angle. You've then got a competition angle, because that's where they're trying to make markets work effectively. The authorities want active and healthy competition in the markets. They don't want it skewed in favour of large operators. And then also in relation to data, there's been so much in terms of the data around GDPR. But now that's shifting more into actually, data is a commodity, and who has access to that data? So aside from a consumer's data and its consumer's rights over its own data, but if you're a business holding a big stash of data, should you be sharing that? How do you make access to that available? So those are some of the kind of things that sit behind this. So we've now got the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act that have both come in on force now, and they are but slowly coming online. The Digital Services Act effectively is regulating online content, so making sure that there's no harmful or illegal content, ensuring that there's transparency in content, has a whole range of provisions. So it's more or less moderating what's online. And that has different sets of obligations for different providers. So you've got some very, very big providers, and then subject to more stringent obligations than smaller online players. You've then got the Digital Markets Act. That's quite different. That's effectively ensuring and setting up a huge regulatory regime on large digital gatekeepers. So, the large digital gatekeepers being the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons and, of this world, the ones that we would expect. But it's also capturing other players such as Airbnb, likely to be Booking.com, possibly Expedia. I don't know the final list because that's not yet in the public domain. And that's going to put a whole set of obligations on those gatekeepers on what they can and can't do. And that's really to ensure that businesses, and as well as consumers, but largely businesses, can deal with it there's a level playing field, such that they are perceived and viewed as having significant market power. And the objective of those regulations really is to ensure that smaller players can operate and can access those markets more fairly. And so that is going to introduce really, the Commission will now act as a sort of regulator rather than just an enforcer, and that's going to be quite a different environment. It will, the big players will be subject to a set of obligations, and they will be continually monitored for those obligations.
Okay. Does it have any impacts? I mean, we have a mix of audience here, like in terms of could be large hotel groups, small hotel groups, travel tech companies. Is there anything that we need to keep an eye out as it relates to DMA and
the DMA or the DSA? Certainly, there's some quite complex obligations in each of those. The DMA is principally going to regulate the large OTAs which sit in your market. So, for instance, any OTAs who become subject to the DMA, and there's a designation process. And there's thought to be maybe a list of about 25 players who will be designated and subject to those obligations. But any OTAs that are subject to those obligations, an example is there is a prohibition on parity clauses, for instance, in the DMA. And so, that means that there's going to be, the relationship with those OTAs subject to the DMA will be different, perhaps, than OTAs who are not subject to the DMA. And it obviously opens up opportunities for companies. There's going to be greater requirements on those companies subject to the DMA to be how they interface with other businesses. So there will be opportunities. I think it's meant to be opening up the market. It's meant to encourage innovation for smaller companies. And so I'd say on the whole it would be a positive impact for many of the audience in this room, because it should open up possibilities in terms of how you operate on those markets.
Okay. And in terms of any difference, obviously this is very European, EU-driven, and to a certain degree in the UK. What about other parts of the world? Are there sort of lots of different types of legislation of the type sort of being formed in other parts of the world that you're aware of?
Yeah, the EU tends to be a bit of a trailblazer in terms of regulation, and then countries will follow. These issues are being looked at by regulators around the world, especially the antitrust regulators. I'd say the EU is obviously the first. We've got the UK sitting behind it, coming up with its own proposals. You've got other regulators in, for instance, Australia. You've got member states as well in Europe also introducing other legislation on some of these themes. The US, they will catch up. They're on a slower trajectory, looking at similar issues. There's quite an aggressive approach being taken in the FTC in the US at the moment on antitrust and certainly consumer protection issues. What I didn't say in terms of some of the consumer protection legislation in Europe, there's now significant fines for getting it wrong, much like there is an antitrust and in privacy. So you're seeing all the penalties now really being upped in a lot of these areas. And so what you'll start to see, I'm sure, going over into the US is a lot of similar considerations. Whether or not they will go to the extent of the regulation that's being looked at in Europe, I don't know. I think that remains to be said. They tend to want, not necessarily to be regulating as heavily as the European markets tend to do.
In terms of, the word Brexit is, we don't bring it up that often anymore, but, and obviously it hasn't impacted the travel regulation side of it so much, because we've kind of followed on in the UK with existing sort of rules. But is that likely to change, and is that going to bring new regulation, new type of rules now that Brexit is sort of out of the way?
Yeah, I mean, to Brexit, it's a funny thing. There's obviously so much fuss around Brexit and what does all this mean? And I think there were probably, some operational issues on Brexit to deal with that was the immediate impact. I think from a legal impact, it's been a lot slower. There's been much less of a Brexit impact. That's partly, and certainly in the UK, we just transposed all the EU law. I think, though, it's now that you're going to start to see the divergence. There's been a delay on this. There's been a real lag. And, for instance, around some of the digital-based regulation in the EU, we're now seeing the UK introduce its own. And that's not going to come online well into 2024. But a lot of the legislation we're seeing is similar, but not quite the same.
Right.
And that's going to cause some problems, I think, for your legal departments actually figuring all this out. And if you've obviously got worldwide operations, you've got a whole myriad of regimes. And it's not helpful that then in Europe you're going to have two slightly different regimes on various things, on data, for example, access to data, or consumer protection issues, for example. It's all going to be, similar themes, similar policy objectives. But the devil will be in the detail, unfortunately.
As always, yeah. No. So in terms of, obviously we talked about the evolution of the different types of regulation that's come and, impacted the, hotel travel sector. And, we haven't even got to AI yet, but...
oh, gosh. Well, I know. There's lots of press about that today with the UK trying to take the lead. Yes.
Right. So
that's a really good example, actually, of them being spooked. They've suddenly realised that, oh, gosh, we've really got to regulate this. And they're in a panic about this. So you're going to see some very quick regulation, I think, being put on the table. I don't know what that's going to look like. But you're going to see, I think really the history of a lot of this regulation that's come into play in the last few years, looking at the online economy, arguably it could have been put in place a long time ago, but there's been very slow to act. I think that experience then now means, and certainly with AI and some of the breakthroughs and the use of ChatGPT and what that meant and some of the concerns on that, I think we're going to see a very, very quick regulatory response. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the best regulatory response.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I think you're going to, you've already seen divergence now, both in the EU. There's two different policy agendas in the EU about how to regulate that. There's a bit of a tussle between commissioners in the European Commission. And then obviously we've got the US being thrown into the mix as well. So who knows where we're going to go on that.
Okay, no, brilliant. We've got a question here. Do we already know as to when the list for the affected companies of DMA will be published?
No, shortly. I think it's going to be certainly by the autumn.
Okay. Any other questions? Please do add onto the Slido QR code which you've got. But just to close out, I mean, we talked about AI very briefly, but you've obviously got other things that can potentially come, are on the horizon. Do you have anything else that you'd sort of keep an eye on for our sector?
Yeah, so obviously there's the short-term rental regulation that's now being looked at by the European Commission to try and sort of take a more standardised approach to some of those issues as a result of those, that sector. So that's coming into play. I talked about the agenda by the European Union on trying to put better connected travel together and trying to regulate that, especially in the rail sector. The rail sector is coming under quite a lot of scrutiny, actually. And so they should be coming out with proposals later in the year. We don't know what the shape of those proposals are, but there could be impacts as well more broadly for the travel sector and for hotel distribution. We've got some provisions and some legislation called the Data Act that is currently being debated with the European Parliament, European institutions. That's going to be about the sharing and access of data. So we'll have to see where that one goes. And then we've got some of the UK legislation coming on board. So there's still a fair amount to slot into place. Part of the reason is there's a European Parliament term, I think, or certainly the term for the commissioners coming up. So a lot is being packed into a relatively short period of time.
So lots of activity, regulatory activity. What can we do? I mean, you know, organizations, if you're a small organization or a large organization, what would be your advice to us to say, okay, all this going on, how do you keep track of it? What makes sense? Where do you figure out where to focus on?
It's a really hard one. It's a really hard one. And we've got clients now coming to us going, look, this is a real headache. How do we do this? I'm working with a lot of legal teams. And I think it's unfortunately, it's keeping abreast of the developments. You know, certainly there's a lobbying opportunity here sometimes on legislation, and don't leave it too late. You know, if you do want to lobby, do get in there, and I'm sure associations like this and then others will take that opportunity, because regulators are interested in hearing the impacts of legislation and how it could impact certain parts of different sectors. So there's certainly a lobbying opportunity on those areas that have not been finalised. In terms of areas that have come in, then it is a matter of mapping. We are trying to map for clients very carefully what all this means. It means actually working together. So, for us in our different practice areas, we're working much more closely together now in our specialisms to knit all this together. But it might mean internally in your organisations that you do have to think about when you're going to get legal advice from your in-house legal teams, actually setting out this full picture and doing some horizon spotting and going, well, okay, what is coming in online this year, next year, 3 years' time? In entering into our commercial agreements, actually, it's going to be fine now, but actually there's a bit of regulation coming into play next year. What does that mean? So it does make it hard, but it's quite important to keep that horizon spotting very at the top of mind all the time.
Okay, well, awareness and preparedness on our side, and yeah, obviously time and resources too.
Exactly.
But if there are no other questions, thank you very much, Caroline, for helping us understand and navigate this complex landscape a little bit. And thank you.
Thank you.